The foster care papers hit the gravel like a gunshot, white and final against the red Georgia clay. Aurelia Brooks stared at the ink, her lungs burning with the kind of air that only tastes like defeat. 18 years. 18 years of being a project. 18 years of being the blessing that slowly curdled into a burden, the moment her belly started to swell with a life she hadn't asked for from a man she couldn't even name. The foster mother stood on the porch of the clapboard house, her silhouette hard against the porch light, eyes cold as a winter morning in the holler. "You got 10 minutes to clear the porch," the woman spat, her voice like rusted shears. "The state stopped paying for you at midnight. We ain't running a charity for girls who don't know how to keep their knees closed." Aurelia's throat was a desert. "It's raining. Where am I supposed to go? The sidewalk's free." The words hit harder than a backhand. Aurelia had spent her life trying to be invisible, trying to be the perfect, quiet ward, scrubbing floors until her knuckles bled and swallowing every insult just to have a roof that didn't leak. She'd given up her pride, her voice, her very identity just to belong to a family that was never hers. And now she was being discarded like yesterday's trash. She looked at the man she'd called Pop for 3 years. He stood in the shadows of the screen door, his hands shoved deep in his pockets, staring at his boots. His silence was a physical weight, heavier than the thunder rolling over the Atlanta skyline. "You're not gonna say nothing?" Aurelia whispered, her voice fracturing. He finally looked up. There wasn't any hate in his eyes. There was something worse. Nothing. Just a hollow, tired compliance. "She's right, Aurelia. We done our part. You brought this trouble on yourself. We can't have a bastard child under this roof. It's over." Something inside Aurelia didn't just break. It cauterized. She looked at the torn bag holding the fragments of her life. She looked at the rain turning the Georgia clay into a bloody smear. She'd loved these people. God help her, she'd tried to earn a love that was always conditional, always a transaction. She'd lost herself trying to be enough for people who saw her as a line item on a ledger. She straightened her spine, the fire finally winning out over the sorrow. She reached down, gripped the handle of her bag and stepped into the downpour. "Fine," she said, her voice dropping into a low, dangerous velvet. She didn't look back. She walked until the house was a memory and the city lights of Atlanta blurred into a neon haze through the storm. She pressed a hand to her stomach, feeling the soft stir of the life inside her, the only thing in the world that was truly hers. "It's you and me now," she rasped into the thunder. The neon sign of the Lucky Star Diner flickered like a dying pulse, casting a sickly yellow glow over the grease-slicked linoleum. 1 year. 12 months of 12-hour shifts that felt like an eternity carved out of bone and grit. Atlanta's humidity clung to the walls, thick as the desperation of the men hunched over cold coffee at 3 a.m. Aurelia Brooks moved through the haze, her body a well-oiled machine fueled by caffeine and pure, unadulterated survival. A tray loaded with heavy ceramic mugs balanced on her left hand, a steady, practiced weight. Her right hand, calloused and quick, wiped down a counter with the rhythm of a soldier cleaning a rifle. She didn't look at the clock. The clock was a liar that only told you how much more you had to suffer. In the cramped, sweltering back room, tucked between crates of industrial-sized ketchup and stacks of flour, sat a makeshift crib. Baby Amelia lay there, a small, radiant miracle in a room that smelled of old dishwater. Every time the swinging kitchen door groaned on its hinges, Aurelia's eyes flicked to the gap, her gaze sharp and voracious. She wasn't just a waitress, she was a sentry. The exhaustion was a physical entity now, a heavy cloak draped over her shoulders, carving dark hollow shadows beneath her luminous eyes. Her golden brown skin was slick with sweat, but her spine remained a steel rod. She had learned the hard way that the world didn't give you anything you didn't take with both hands. "Order up, Brooks. Stop daydreaming and move," the cook barked, his voice a rough rasp through the serving window. Aurelia didn't blink. She slid the tray onto the counter, her movements fluid and silent. She ignored the leering stares of the truckers and the hollowed-out shadows of the city's underbelly. She was invisible to them, just another piece of the scenery, another cog in the machine. But beneath the stained apron and the tired smile, a fire was smoldering, a quiet, dangerous heat that refused to be extinguished. She retreated to the back for a fleeting second, bending over the crib. She let the tip of her finger graze Amelia's soft cheek. The child stirred, a tiny hand reaching out to grab her thumb. For that one heartbeat, the roar of the exhaust fans and the clatter of silverware vanished. There was no diner, no debt, no rainy nights in the mud. There was only the weight of the girl and the vow Aurelia had made in the thunder. "I got you," she whispered, her voice a low, gravelly promise. She straightened her apron, wiped a stray tear before it could fall, and kicked the kitchen door open. She stepped back into the light, a tray in one hand and the fire of a mother's soul in the other, ready to fight for every cent the world owed her. The rain outside the Lucky Star was a relentless, rough sheet of ice, drumming against the glass like a warning nobody was listening to. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of burnt grease and the low, guttural hum of the refrigeration units. Aurelia moved through the diner like a dusk in a war zone, her senses tuned to the subtle shift of the front door's chime. He didn't walk in so much as he occupied the space. He took the corner booth, the one where the shadows lingered longest. He was wrapped in a charcoal suit that looked like armor, every line sharp enough to draw blood. He didn't look like the usual bottom feeders who drifted in to escape the Georgia humidity. He looked like the storm itself had taken human form and decided to sit down. Mark Min-jun. Aurelia felt the back of her neck prickle. She'd dealt with wolves before. The loud ones, the drunks, the men who used their fists to feel powerful. But this man was different. He possessed an unsettling, absolute calm that made the oxygen feel thin. He wasn't looking at the menu. He wasn't looking at the neon clock. He was looking at her. She approached the table, the tray a shield against her chest. She had her mask on, the one she'd perfected over a year of survival. It was a face of polite indifference, a blank slate that told the world she was just a waitress and nothing more. But as she stood over the booth, her shadow falling across his table, his eyes met hers. They weren't hungry. They were surgical. "Coffee," he said. His voice was a low, resonant rasp like tires over gravel. "Black or with poison?" she replied, the dry wit of the desperate slipping out before she could check it. A dusky of a smile touched his lips, but it didn't reach his eyes. He didn't wince. He didn't look away. He looked through the fatigue, through the stained apron, through the defensive wall she'd built around her soul. He saw the fire she thought she'd hidden. He saw the way her hand moved toward the back room every time the baby stirred. "Just the coffee," he murmured, his gaze never wavering. "And whatever peace you can find in a place like this." The weight of his stare was a physical pressure, a silent recognition that stripped her bare. Most men looked at her skin or her shape. This man looked at her scars. He sat there, a king of shadows in a kingdom of grease, watching her with a curiosity that felt more dangerous than any threat she'd ever heard. Aurelia turned away, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She could feel him behind her, a silent, watchful deity in the corner booth. She knew with a sudden bone-deep certainty that the city hadn't just demanded her strength tonight. It had brought her the one thing she feared most, someone who knew exactly who she was. The air in the Lucky Star was thick enough to choke a saint, a cocktail of burnt fat and stale tobacco. Aurelia moved through it like a shadow in a trench, her mind 1,000 miles away, anchored only by the distant rhythmic cooing of Amelia in the back. She was running on fumes, her vision blurring at the edges as the 4 a.m. shadows stretched long and hungry across the floor. He was there again. The man in the corner booth. He sat like a stone in a rushing river, motionless while the world decayed around him. He wore a suit that cost more than the diner's entire lease, a sharp charcoal silhouette that didn't belong in a place where hope came to die. Aurelia approached with the pot, her hands trembling with a fatigue that settled deep in the marrow. She didn't look at his face, she never did. To her he was just another mouth to feed, another tip to scrape together. But as she leaned in, the world tilted. Her knee buckled just a fraction and the heavy glass carafe slipped. The scalding liquid hit the table like a black tide, splashing across the polished wood and onto the man's pristine sleeve. I'm so sorry, sir." The words tumbled out, sharp and panicked. She dropped to her knees, a rag in her hand, scrubbing frantically. Her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. In this city, a mistake like this usually earned a snarl, a curse, or a hand raised in anger. She braced for the impact of his voice, her head bowed, her dignity pulled tight around her like a shroud. But there was only silence. A heavy, magnetic stillness that demanded she look up. Aurelia lifted her head. For the first time she really saw him. Mark Min-jun didn't look at the ruin of his suit. He didn't look at the mess on the table. He looked at her. His eyes weren't cold. They were penetrating, stripping away the stained apron and the exhaustion to find the raw, burning iron beneath. He saw the sorrow etched into the corners of her mouth and the fire of a survivor flickering in her gaze. It wasn't the look of a customer. It was the look of a man who had stumbled upon a hidden treasure in a graveyard. "It's fine," he said. His voice was a low, melodic rasp, calm as a voracious cat at rest. There was no venom, no threat. Just a terrifying, absolute composure that made her breath hitch in her throat. "I can get you a towel, I can." "I said it's fine," he repeated, his gaze never wavering. He didn't pull away. He watched her with a curiosity that felt like a physical weight. A man used to controlled chaos suddenly fascinated by a different kind of strength. Aurelia stood slowly, her pulse thundering. She had spent a year being invisible, but under his stare she felt like the only person left in the world. He didn't move. He just watched her, and in that silent corner of Atlanta, the air shifted, charged with the dangerous electricity of a fuse finally reaching the powder. The rent receipt sat on the scarred wooden table like a white flag in a war zone. Aurelia stared at it, the paid-in-full stamp searing into her retinas. She had the envelope in her hand, the cash she'd bled for over 7 double shifts clutched tight, but the landlord had just grunted and walked away, his eyes avoiding hers. "Anonymous," he'd said. "In Atlanta nobody did anything for free. Not unless they were buying a piece of your soul." She pushed open the door to her apartment, the hinges screaming in the dark. The air inside was different, cleaner, cooler. She reached for the light pull, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She braced for an intruder, for the violence that always seemed to be lurking just beyond the shadows. But the room was empty. There, in the corner where the peeling wallpaper met the floor, sat a new crib. It wasn't the rickety second-hand cage she'd scavenged from the curb. This was solid oak, stained dark as a winter night, with railings that didn't shake and a mattress that didn't sag. It looked like a fortress. It looked like peace. Aurelia dropped her bag, the sound of her few belongings hitting the floor like a muffled thud. She crossed the room, her fingers trembling as she traced the smooth, polished wood. There was no note. No card. Just the lingering shadow-like scent of something expensive, smoke, whiskey, and the sharp ozone of a coming storm. She turned to the window, looking out over the rough skyline of the city. The neon pulse of the lucky star flickered in the distance. A reminder of the man who sat in the corner booth with eyes that peeled back the layers of her life. Mark Min-jun. He hadn't spoken more than 10 words to her, but his presence was a heavy, magnetic weight that had followed her home. He wasn't a businessman. He was something deeper, something more ancient. A hunter who had decided to stand guard over the lamb. Aurelia picked up Amelia, holding the sleeping child close to her chest, feeling the warmth of the girl's breath against her neck. She should have been terrified. She should have packed her bags and run back into the rain. But as she looked at the sturdy oak of the crib and the paid receipt on the table, a strange, sharp hope began to bloom in the wreckage of her chest. She wasn't invisible anymore. Someone was watching. Someone with dark eyes and a silence that felt like a shield. She sat in the rocking chair, the wood creaking softly in the quiet apartment, watching the shadows dance on the wall. The world was still a cruel, unforgiving place, but for the first time in a year, the door felt locked against the dark. The sidewalk was a strip of wet asphalt that mirrored the rough neon of the city, slick with the remnants of a midnight downpour. Aurelia walked fast, the strap of her bag digging into her shoulder like a dull blade. Amelia was heavy against her chest, a warm weight wrapped in a thin blanket, her soft breathing the only rhythm in a world that had gone dissonant. She felt the shadow before she heard the footsteps. It was a cold prickle at the base of her neck, a primal warning that the darkness behind her had teeth. "Running away again, Aurelia? Just like you ran out on the family." The voice was a raw rasp, thick with the stench of cheap bourbon and years of unwashed resentment. She froze. In the mouth of a narrow alley, bathed in the sickly green light of a buzzing street lamp, stood Silas. He was a murky from her foster years, a man whose parental guidance had always come with a closed fist and a heavy breath. He looked smaller than she remembered, more ragged, but the cruelty in his eyes was a familiar, sharp edge. "I don't have anything for you, Silas," Aurelia said, her voice a low, gravelly warning. She shifted Amelia, her body instinctively forming a shield. You got plenty, he sneered, taking a stumbling step forward. The rain had matted his graying hair to his forehead, and his hands shook with a violent tremor. The state stopped paying, but I didn't stop wanting what I'm owed. That brat you're holding, she's part of the ledger. You don't just walk out on 3 years of room and board without a settlement. He lunged, his fingers clawing at the strap of her bag, his breath a foul cloud against her face. Aurelia swung her shoulder, pivoting with a strength born of pure, desperate necessity. Get away from us, she hissed. Who's gonna make me? Silas laughed, a wet, rattling sound that ended in a cough. He reached out again, his eyes widening with a sudden, exploitative greed. I saw the way you look at the fancy cars in the city. You found yourself a mark, didn't you? Well, I'm your blood now, Aurelia. And I'm taking what's mine. He grabbed her arm, his grip like a rusted vice. Aurelia didn't scream. She couldn't afford to wake the child, and she knew the city didn't answer screams. She braced her feet against the wet concrete, her eyes searching the shadows for a weapon, her heart a drumbeat of war in the silence of the alley. The air felt thin, charged with the static of a coming explosion. Silas pulled her closer, his face a mask of drunk entitlement. It's time to pay the bill, girl, he taught. The air didn't just grow cold, it died. 1 second, Silas was a snarling, whiskey-breathed animal clawing at Aurelia's life, and the next he was a shadow staring at his own funeral. The atmospheric pressure in the alleyway plummeted, the rain suddenly feeling like lead pellets against the pavement. Aurelia felt the shift in the marrow of her bones, a heavy magnetic presence that moved through the dark with the silence of a blade sliding into silk. Mark Min-jun stepped out of the shadows. He didn't run. He didn't shout. He didn't even raise his hands. He simply walked until he stood 5 feet away, a charcoal-suited reaper carved out of the Atlanta night. The sickly green glow of the street lamp hit the sharp angles of his face, casting his eyes into pits of absolute bottomless black. He looked less like a man and more like a force of nature that had decided, for one brief moment, to take a human shape. Silas froze, his hand still clamped like a rusted claw on Aurelia's arm. The drunk's bravado evaporated, replaced by a primal, soul-deep terror that turned his skin the color of wet ash. He looked at Mark, and for the first time in his miserable life he understood what real power looked like. It wasn't a raised fist or a loud voice. It was the absolute, terrifying calm of a man who could erase you from existence without breaking his stride. Mark's gaze shifted to Silas's hand on Aurelia. He didn't say a word. He didn't have to. The air between them vibrated with a silent, rough frequency that promised a violence so total, it would leave nothing behind but the smell of ozone. Silas let go. His fingers didn't just release. They recoiled as if they'd touched white-hot iron. He took a stumbling step back, his boots splashing into a puddle, his chest heaving with a panicked, wheezing breath. He looked at Aurelia, then back at the nightmare in the suit, and he realized he was standing in the presence of a god of the underworld. I didn't know, Silas stammered, his voice a pathetic, high-pitched whimper. I didn't know she was. I'm gone. He didn't just walk away, he fled. He scrambled back into the darkness of the main street, his footsteps echoing a frantic, uneven rhythm against the brick walls until the city swallowed him whole. The silence that rushed back in was deafening. Aurelia stood trembling, her arms locked around Amelia, her heart a drumbeat of war in the sudden vacuum. She turned her head slowly, looking at the man who had appeared from the shadows. Mark stood perfectly still, the rain bead chaining off the shoulders of his coat. The aura of the boss was still there, thick, dark, and utterly untouchable. But as his eyes met hers, the rough edge of the night seemed to soften just a fraction. He didn't ask if she was okay. He didn't offer a hand. He just stood there, a silent sentinel in the rain, watching over the only thing in Atlanta that still held a spark of light. The rain had slowed to a persistent rhythmic thrum against the metal trash bins, but the air remained charged, heavy with the scent of ozone and the man who stood before her. Silas was gone, a fading echo of footfalls and terror in the dark, but the silence Mark Min-jun brought with him was more deafening than any scream. He stood in the mouth of the alley, a shadow carved out of the city's heart, his charcoal suit pristine despite the filth of the gutter. Aurelia didn't retreat. She adjusted the sleeping weight of Amelia, her eyes locked on his with a defiance that should have been impossible for a woman who had just stared into the abyss. Who are you? Her voice was a low, gravelly scrape, stripping away the neon and the mystery. It wasn't a question of curiosity. It was a demand for the truth in a world that had only ever fed her lies. Mark hesitated. It was a microscopic fracture, a tremor in the absolute composure of a man who moved the world's shadows with a whisper. He looked at her, really looked at her, and for the first time the exploitative mask flickered. He wasn't looking at a waitress or a victim. He was looking at a woman who stood in the wreckage of her life and refused to blink. "I am someone who sees the fire," he said, his voice a melodic hum that vibrated in her chest. "That's a poet's answer," Aurelia countered, her spine a steel rod. "Poets don't make drunk men run for their lives just by standing in the light. Poets don't pay rent in secret or put oak cribs in a stranger's room. You're a man of blood, Mark Min-jun. I can smell it on you." Mark took a step forward, his movements fluid and dangerous, but he stopped just short of her space. The power he radiated was immense, a physical heat that pushed against the cold Atlanta rain, but it found no purchase in her gaze. He was used to men who groveled and women who folded, but Aurelia Brooks stood her ground like a fortress. "In this city," Mark began, his jaw tight, his words measured like a confession he hadn't prepared to give, "I am the hand that decides who keeps what they own. I am the shadow that the light fears." He paused, his dark eyes searching hers, looking for the flicker of fear that usually punctuated his name. He found only the steady, burning coal of her resolve. "But when I look at you, the shadow feels like a lie." He struggled with the words, the armor of the mafia boss cracking under the weight of a vulnerability he couldn't name. He wasn't a savior and he wasn't a saint, but in the presence of her quiet strength, the monster felt the pull of the leash. "I don't want you hurt," he finally scraped, the most honest thing he had said in a decade. Aurelia watched him, the rain slicking her hair to her forehead. She didn't thank him. She didn't smile. She simply nodded once, acknowledging the truth in the dark. The boss had found his equal in the wreckage, and the war for her soul had only just begun. The new keys felt heavy in Aurelia's palm, a cold, solid weight that didn't belong in a hand accustomed to the flimsy brass of dead-end rentals. The building sat on the edge of the highlands, a brick fortress cloaked in ivy and the quiet, expensive hum of security. It wasn't the diner. It wasn't the alley. The woman from the charity, a sharp-eyed professional with a voice like smoothed velvet, had called it a New Horizons grant. She spoke of anonymous donors and relocation assistance for working mothers, her smile perfect and practiced. Aurelia didn't believe a word of it. The grant smelled too much of oak high-end espresso, and the silent magnetic pull of the man who lived in the dark. She stepped inside, her boots silent on the thick slate-colored rugs. The air was filtered, cool, devoid of the grease and rot of the Lucky Star. In the center of the living room, bathed in the soft amber glow of recessed lighting, stood a crib that matched the one from her old apartment. The same iron-strong oak, the same promise of a sanctuary. Aurelia walked to the floor-to-ceiling window. Below, the Atlanta skyline was a rough crown of glass and neon, but from this height the chaos looked manageable. She wasn't being housed, she was being fortified. She set Amelia down on the plush rug, watching the child marvel at the space. The kitchen was stocked with groceries that didn't come from a corner store. Fresh fruit, glass bottles of milk, things Aurelia hadn't touched since she was a blessing instead of a burden. She knew the price of this kind of peace. In the world she'd survived, a gift was just a debt waiting for a collection date. She looked for the cameras, for the hidden wires, for the eyes that were surely watching. But all she found was the silence. Mark Min-jun was everywhere in this room. He was in the deadbolt that clicked with a heavy, satisfying finality. He was in the thick glass that dampened the roar of the city. He was the quiet upgrade, the unseen hand shifting the pieces of her life like a grandmaster on a board she couldn't see. She picked up a small black handset on the counter. No dial tone. Just a direct line. She stared at it, her reflection shadow-like in the polished granite. "You think you can buy the fire," she whispered, her voice a low, gravelly rasp that vibrated against the expensive walls. She didn't feel like a charity case. She felt like a high-value asset being moved to a secure location. She sat on the edge of the sofa, her hand resting on the hidden knife she still carried in her waistband. The bed was soft, the food was plenty, and her daughter was safe behind reinforced doors. But as Aurelia watched the sun dip behind the Georgia hills, She knew the bill was coming. And when the boss finally came to collect, she'd be ready to show him that some things were still beyond his reach. The rain had returned, a relentless drumming against the reinforced glass that made the penthouse feel like a submarine lost in a neon sea. Aurelia didn't turn when the door hummed open. He didn't need to. The air in the room simply thickened, pulling toward the man who walked with the weight of a kingdom on his shoulders. Mark Min-jun didn't go to the bar. He didn't check the perimeter. He sat on the low leather bench across from her, his charcoal jacket discarded, his shirt sleeves rolled up to reveal forearms corded with tension and a rough silver line that ran from wrist to elbow. That one didn't come from a boardroom, Aurelia said, her voice a low, gravelly rasp. Mark looked at the scar, his eyes distant, reflecting the lightning that flickered over the skyline. It was the price of a seat at a table I never should have sat at, he said, his voice a melodic growl. Every inch of power I own was paid for in a currency of blood and brothers. I built a throne out of the things I had to burn. That's the cost of being the shadow, Aurelia. You eventually forget what it's like to stand in the sun. He looked at her, his gaze heavy with a weary, ancient truth. Power doesn't make you free. It just builds a bigger cage. Aurelia leaned forward, the soft amber light catching the sharp angles of her face. She pulled back the collar of her shirt just enough to show the faint, rough mark near her collarbone, a reminder of a blessing turned into a burden on a night that had gone wrong long ago. You think your cage is special because it's made of gold, she said, her voice steady as a heartbeat. Survival has a cost too. I traded my name for a paycheck. I traded my pride for a roof that didn't leak. Every time I bowed my head to a man who didn't deserve it, a piece of me died. I've spent 18 years learning how to be small so I wouldn't be broken. That's my scar, Mark. It's the kind you can't see, the kind that makes you look at a gift and see a trap. She looked at Amelia, sleeping soundly in the oak crib, a tiny island of innocence in a room full of shadows. I didn't survive for the power. I survived so she wouldn't have to. Mark reached out, his hand hovering in the space between them, a bridge made of scars and shared silence. For the first time he didn't look like a boss. He looked like a man who had finally met someone who spoke his language. The language of the wounded. We're both built on wreckage, he rasped. Aurelia didn't pull away. She met his gaze, the fire in her eyes meeting the darkness in his. In the quiet of the high-rise, the boss and the survivor sat in the ruins of their pasts, realizing that the only thing more dangerous than their enemies was the truth they were starting to find in each other. The glass-walled office at the summit of the city felt like a tomb, cold and smelling of ozone and high-end static. Mark Min-jun stood at the window, his reflection a shadow superimposed over the sprawling rough veins of Atlanta's highway system. Down there, in a brick fortress he'd bought with blood, was the only thing that made the air in his lungs feel real. His phone buzzed on the mahogany desk, a frantic rhythmic heartbeat. It was the council. A shipment was stalled at the port of Savannah. A rival faction was sniffing at the borders of his territory like starved wolves. A year ago he would have dismantled them with a whisper. A year ago the business was the only pulse he followed. Now he didn't even look at the screen. He was watching the live feed on his private monitor instead. High-definition shadows. Aurelia was moving through the kitchen of the safe house, her movements fluid, a warrior in a domestic cage. He watched the way she tucked a stray lock of hair behind her ear, the way she checked the locks on the windows with a practiced, paranoid grace. Every breath she took was a wire he was tripped on. "Boss," a voice rasped from the doorway. It was Han, his second, a man whose face was a map of scars and loyalty. "The Greeks are at the warehouse. They're asking for you. If you don't show, the peace breaks." Mark didn't turn. His eyes were locked on Aurelia as she picked up Amelia, pressing her forehead against the child's. "Let it break," he said, his voice a low melodic growl that vibrated with a dangerous indifference. "Mark," Han stepped forward, his voice tight. "You're neglecting the foundation. This girl, she's a variable we can't afford. She's a target. And right now she's the only hand on your throat." Mark finally turned, his gaze a sudden voracious flash that made the air in the room vanish. He moved with a terrifying silent speed, pinning Han against the doorframe with one hand buried in the man's lapel. The boss was gone. There was only a man driven by a singular, frantic obsession. "She is not a variable," Mark breathed, his words a gravelly promise against Han's skin. She is the only thing in this rotting city that isn't a lie. If the empire burns to keep her safe, then let it turn to ash. I am done guarding a throne. I'm guarding her. He let go, his hands shaking with a tension he couldn't kill. He turned back to the screen, back to the golden brown skin and the firelit eyes. He was a man of logic who had succumbed to a fever. He knew the cost. He knew that in his world a weakness wasn't a flaw, it was a death sentence. But as he watched Aurelia smile at the girl, Mark Min-jun realized he'd already pulled the trigger, and he was more than happy to watch the world bleed out. The peace of the safe house was a lie, shattered by the heavy rhythmic thud of a door being kicked off its hinges in the garage below. Aurelia didn't scream. She moved. In one fluid motion, she snatched Amelia from the rug and slipped into the crawl space behind the pantry, her hand clamping gently but firmly over the child's mouth. Through the slats of the ventilation duct, the world turned red. Mark Min-jun entered the concrete space like a demon exhaled from the mouth of hell. He wasn't the man who asked if she'd eaten. He wasn't the guardian with the weary eyes. He was a force of nature, his charcoal suit jacket gone, his white shirt splattered with a dark visceral crimson that wasn't his own. Two men were dragged in behind him, broken and pleading, their voices a rough mess of terror. They were the business associates Mark had mentioned, the ones who had threatened the perimeter. I gave you a perimeter, Mark said, his voice no longer a melodic growl, but a cold, flat mechanical grate that chilled the marrow of Aurelia's bones. I told you the Highlands were dusk territory. We didn't know, boss. We just... Mark didn't let him finish. He moved with a terrifying, blurred efficiency. There was no movie screen drama, just the sickening, wet crunch of bone and the heavy, dull impact of a man being dismantled by a professional. Mark's hands, the same hands that had gifted a solid oak crib, were now instruments of calculated, absolute destruction. He didn't look angry. He looked like a machine clearing a blockage. Aurelia watched, her eyes wide, her breath hitching in a throat that felt like it was filled with glass. This wasn't a businessman. This was the dealer of violence she had smelled in the alley, finally unmasked in the harsh glare of the garage lights. Every strike, every cold, rhythmic blow echoed against the walls of her sanctuary, stripping away the charity, the grant, and the new horizons. The man who brought her peace was a monster who commanded the dark. Mark stood over the wreckage of the men, his chest heaving, his knuckles split and weeping. He looked up then, his gaze tracking toward the hidden vent as if he could feel her heart hammering against the wood. For a heartbeat, their eyes met through the darkness of the crawl space. In that look, the quiet guardian died, and the mafia boss stood naked in his blood-soaked truth. Aurelia pulled back into the shadows, the heat of the room suddenly icy. She had traded a foster home for a fortress, but the fortress was built on a graveyard. The man who saw her fire was the same man who set the world ablaze. And as Amelia stirred in her arms, Aurelia knew the peace was over. The truth had arrived and it tasted like copper and old, familiar fear. The air in the penthouse was thick with the copper tang of the garage, a phantom scent that clung to Aurelia's skin like oil. She moved through the rooms with the silent, frantic grace of a cornered animal. The gifted luxury of the Highlands felt like a gilded cage, and the man who held the key was a butcher draped in silk. She didn't use the designer luggage. She went for the torn nylon bag she'd carried out of the foster home, the one that still held the smell of rain and red Georgia clay. It was a reminder of who she was. A survivor, not a trophy. She packed only the essentials, bottles, diapers, the few clothes she'd bought with her own diner money. She left the expensive jewelry, the cashmere throws, and the high-end electronics on the floor like discarded husks. He's a lie, Amelia, she whispered, her voice a rough file as she strapped the child into the worn carrier. The piece, the crib, it's all built on bone. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a drumbeat of war and terror. She kept seeing Mark's eyes through the vent, cold, efficient, and stained with the darkness of 1,000 deaths. She had fallen for a mask. She had let a monster touch her soul because he'd looked at her with a curiosity she'd mistaken for love. But love didn't crunch bone in the dark. Love didn't command a kingdom of shadows. She moved to the kitchen, her eyes tracking the blinking red light of the security system. She knew he was watching. She knew the quiet guardian had eyes in every shadow. But she also knew the blind spots. The service elevator used by the night cleaners, the loading dock that bled into the labyrinth of the city's industrial gut. She stepped into the hallway, the cool, filtered air feeling like a shroud. Every hum of the building's machinery sounded like his voice, a melodic growl coming to claim his property. She hit the basement button, the descent making her stomach drop into a void. When the doors opened to the humid, exhaust-choked air of the loading bay, she didn't hesitate. She stepped out into the midnight heat of Atlanta, the city's roar rising up to meet her like a physical blow. She didn't have a plan. She didn't have a destination. She only had the weight of the girl and the primal screaming need to put miles of asphalt between her heart and the man who owned the shadows. She vanished into the neon haze of the streets, a shadow fleeing a god. She had survived the foster years and she would survive this. But as she looked back one last time at the glass tower, a tear tracked through the grime on her cheek. She wasn't just running from his violence. She was running from the terrifying truth that she had loved the monster. And in his world, love was the most dangerous weapon of all. The boardroom was a tomb of glass and cold ambition, smelling of expensive tobacco and the metallic tang of unspent rage. Outside, the Atlanta skyline bled neon onto the low-hanging clouds, but inside the light was clinical, unforgiving. Mark Min-jun sat at the head of the mahogany table, his hands folded, his knuckles still swollen and discolored, a grim testament to the garage floor. "She's a liability, Mark." The voice belonged to Chong, an elder with eyes like flint and a heart of rusted iron. She saw the machinery. He saw the blood. In our world, a witness is a loose thread, and threads get pulled until the whole suit unravels. A murmur of assent rippled through the shadowed faces around the table. These were men of the ledger, men who weighed human life against the stability of the empire. "She has the child," another rasped. "If the feds find her, if she breaks under the pressure of the street, your legacy becomes a federal indictment. Silence her. Or we will." The air in the room vanished. Mark stood slowly, the movement fluid and explosive, a dark god rising from a throne of shadows. He leaned over the table, his shadow stretching long and sharp across the maps of their territories. When he spoke, his voice wasn't a growl. It was a low, melodic vibration that carried the promise of an open grave. "You think you're talking about a witness," Mark breathed, the words a gravelly rasp. "You're talking about the only thing in this city that isn't for sale. You're talking about the fire I chose to guard." "She fled, Mark," Chong countered, his voice steady but thin. "She chose the gutter over your protection. She's a dusk now." "Then let her be a dusk," Mark snapped, the command hitting the room like a physical blow. "She is untouchable. If a single one of your cleaners steps within a mile of her, I won't just pull the thread. I will burn the loom. I will dismantle every one of you until there's nothing left but ash and memory. Do you understand?" The silence that followed was absolute. They saw the madness in his eyes, the rough, terrifying truth that the boss had finally found something he valued more than the crown. Mark turned his back on them, walking to the window. He looked out at the sprawling, chaotic labyrinth of the city. He could find her. With a single phone call, he could have her tracked, cornered, and brought back to his gilded cage. He could force her to be safe. But he remembered the fire in her eyes, the way she stood her ground in the alley, and the way she looked at him when she thought he was a man instead of a monster. To hunt her was to break her, and he had spent his life breaking things. "Let her run," he whispered to the glass, his breath fogging the reflection of his own weary face. He was the shadow and she was the sun. For the first time in his life, he chose the darkness of loneliness over the violence of possession. He let her go not because he was weak but because he was finally strong enough to let her be free. The Georgia sun was a dying ember, bleeding gold and bruised purple over the horizon, casting long rough shadows across the quiet park on the city's edge. Aurelia sat on a weathered bench, her hands wrapped around a paper cup of lukewarm coffee, watching Amelia chase the fading light across the grass. The city was a distant roar here, a hum of machinery and broken dreams that she had finally learned to tune out. She was back to the grind, back to the honest ache of a day's work, living in a small room that smelled of cedar and hard-won peace. She didn't need to hear the car to know he was there. The air simply changed, growing heavy and still, charged with the familiar ozone of a coming storm. Mark Min-jun approached with a slow, deliberate gait. He wasn't the shadow in the charcoal suit anymore. He wore a simple coat, his hair tousled by the wind, the sharp, predacious edges of his face softened by a weariness that went deeper than bone. He stopped 10 paces away, his hands visible and empty. No weapons, no guards, no crown. Aurelia stood, her spine a steel rod, her gaze locking onto his with the old fire. I told you I was done with the shadows, Mark. I know, he said, his voice a low, gravelly rasp that vibrated in the quiet air. He didn't move closer. He stayed in the light, vulnerable and exposed. I didn't come to bring you back to the cage, Aurelia. I didn't come to offer you a fortress or a grant or a lie. He took a sharp breath, the absolute composure of the boss finally crumbling, leaving behind only the raw, bleeding truth of the man. I came to tell you that the throne is empty. I walked away. There's no more blood on the ledger, no more shadows to guard. I have nothing left but a name that people used to fear and a heart that doesn't know how to beat without the sound of your voice. He looked at Amelia, then back to Aurelia, his dark eyes brimming with a terrifying, naked honesty. I'm not a savior. I'm just a man who's tired of being cold. I'm not asking you to love the monster. I'm asking if you can live with the man. The silence stretched, thick with the scent of pine and the weight of everything they had survived. Aurelia looked at him, really looked at him, and saw the fracture in the armor, the shared scars that finally matched. She didn't need perfect. She had lived through perfect lies. She needed the grit, the truth, the reality of a man willing to burn his world down just to stand in her light. She didn't say a word. She simply reached out, her fingers grazing his calloused hand. Mark's grip was warm, desperate, and solid. The sun dipped below the trees, and as the first stars began to pierce the Georgia sky, Aurelia realized she wasn't running anymore. She wasn't a blessing or a burden or a witness. She was home.